I just wanted to start by saying um, I have the position of sort of ending the day. We've had some very good presentations, and I wanted to start away from my comfort zone, which is actually thinking like a businessman. Um, and oh, I'm really struggling with this, with the slide presentation thingy. And for any business, there's potentially three things that they need to have clearly in their sights. That that they have awareness about what is it that may shut their business down, that they have an opportunity to increase their market share in some way, or that there's a way to increase value by lowering costs. Now, palm oil as a commodity grown in plantations is struggling on all three counts. If I go back in time in the 1980s and 1990s, most of the reports around oil palm were around the cultivation of oil palm or biology of oil palm. Today, it's complicated by labor abuses, deforestation, market issues in terms of access to the EU markets. The UK is coming up with their own policies now about deforestation-free supply chains. So palm oil has become complex because it's no longer about local acceptance, meeting a legal requirement, but also it's about the challenges of meeting different market needs. And in some ways also opening itself up to the sort of geopolitics that goes with this. Does Malaysia have the largest market share out there today? They used to, maybe 20, 30 years ago. Today, oil palm is grown in several other countries. Indonesia has surpassed it in terms of volumes. There's also Latin America, which is popping up in terms of not volume, but value, because there you have national governments who have adopted RSPO as a strategic advantage. So they are looking at having all of their production RSPO certified. Now, their position in terms of distance to Europe, to America, positions them very well in terms of accessing a higher value market, or maybe even potentially taking over in terms of where Southeast Asia oils used to traditionally go to. Thirdly, you have this issue of costs. And initially, it was all the traditional things of labor costs. Labor costs, when you're dependent on foreign labor, is also increasing. The price of an important input such as fertilizer has also been increasing, or is a high cost input for most oil palm plantations. Thirdly, the cost for compliance is also something which is challenging the markets. And we've seen ourselves amongst the smaller producers that for them to meet a cost of compliance in terms of meeting an MSBO national certification requirement is the costs are prohibitively it's high, high enough so much so that they're also thinking of exiting agriculture altogether. So you have this sort of aggregation of the smaller producers going to be or being eaten up by the bigger guys. And that seems to be what we're seeing with a commodity like oil palm. And also you've got to remember that, when you look at the lens of history, no one commodity has lasted more than 100 odd years. So at one point it was rubber, this picture, and today is oil palm. But oil palm is already at the 100-year mark. So where is it going? So in terms of where we come from, I think what we have seen is this idea that actually, if you look at things differently, and for a long time, people have seen smallholders as a problem, I actually see them as a role model. Maybe not all, but we find really cool examples where smallholders have taken risks, they've tried different things, and we've just made it our point that this is where we see innovation. And most of our work is around supporting smallholders and also making sure that there is a connection back into these global market actors. So what I can offer is essentially 5 simple lessons, most of which is based on common sense. The first lesson is that, you just have to look back in time. And we're not talking in terms of 100-year cycles. You're talking in terms of thousands of years. And you can see in the past that, some of the earliest forms of agriculture around the Fertile Crescent and what have you, killed itself essentially because it did not have a form of agriculture that conserved soils. Now there was another sort of society which I've only just started to read more about, and we often think of the Amazons as being a forested landscape, deep jungles and what have you. But if you go back far enough, you found that there were some of the largest population of indigenous people living in cities, expansive cities, growing stuff. And it was all to do around a different form of agriculture, which wasn't about tilling the soils, but it was about essentially putting your waste back into the soils and keep doing it. So what people call today terra preta soils are essentially a product of thousands of years of continually farming in this way of putting organic matter back into their farms. In the 1800s, the plantations, which eventually got moved south from America into the into the sort of Latin American regions, they benefited from this, resulting in some of the best gains in terms of cane, etc. But also with the arrival of outsiders into these sort of remote territories, most of these people eventually, the pre-contact civilization, most of them disappeared. So this was before, and then later on, you had these colonial planters that came along in the 1800s. But anyway, so this was the first lesson, which I think. So when people tell me, oil palm has been around for 100 years, pause and think, well, what else has happened in the past? And what we saw with the Fertile Crescent repeats itself in many different cultures, where once they've thrived and once you screw up your soils, that's it, civilization disappears. So then the second kind of lesson that I sort of picked up along the way is that you always have to observe nature. And I found in the literature, some of the best examples seem to be these guys who, essentially this fellow here, this Albert Howard, was one of the pioneers in the almost 100 years ago in terms of understanding the role of nature in agriculture. And he was a lab scientist. He was sort of looking at pests and diseases, I think. And he was lucky enough that he was posted into the sort of colonial frontiers in India and different places. And he said that, sitting in the lab and understanding agriculture was the worst place to be. I'd rather be out in the farm or learning from the peasants, because their form of agriculture and observing what they are doing was more important than sitting in the lab and studying all these different things. So from his observations and his trials, there's a number of things where he's looked at composting on scale as something that he wanted to industrialize. He wanted more people to adopt. And in his books, you start to find references to plantations in Malaysia, in India, I think also in the Philippines and different parts, where you've had planters who've been listening to his message and then trying to take this on board and actually putting them into a plantation environment. So all this could happen. And in some ways, we've forgotten some of these very basic things. But fast forward to the last 10, 20 years, I think the understanding about what is going on in the soils, the interaction between plants, the mycorrhizome, bacteria, fungi, etc., has far advanced just because the methods of studying has allowed us to understand these interactions better. So there's a lot of things that we can't see, but And we can't explain everything. But I think what these traditional farmers, farmers who have learned it from their fathers and what, et cetera, over long periods of time, all point to the same direction. You have to treat your soils well, and this whole idea of living soils means that your plants actually get most of what it needs, and in this way keeps the plants healthy. Now, what I have faced when I'm sitting with these ideas and starting to read up about permaculture and all of these different things and experimenting in my own gardens is when I bring this to professionals in the oil palm industry or these agronomists with years of experience, or I gave a talk in Wageningen and I was basically told, your ideas are wrong, these systems will collapse. But when you start to forget to listen to these professionals and you just listen to the small producers themselves, you start to see that actually it doesn't take much to adopt a chemical-free regime. It is about brainstorming a little bit more about what kinds of organic material you can bring into the farm. But eventually, this idea of boosting the microbiology that's below ground leads us very naturally towards increasing diversity within the farms, because you're starting to think differently, that you actually want more stuff growing. More stuff growing means that there's more photosynthesis, etc., but it's also meaning more carbon back into the soil. And this feeds the microorganisms, and these are the things that make the farms healthy. So it actually makes so much sense when you start listening to nature and listening to the people who are closer to the ground than these professionals. But I do listen to professionals. I'm not so stubborn. Then the fourth lesson is, more diversity means you can actually make more money from all this. And I think it's some of the things that, I can't remember whether Nath was saying this, but we've just tracked with a few of the farmers, and this is something that we're quite keen to look at a bit more, like just studying more from the farmers who are directly connected to us. But we're starting to see at least, there is a difference between being certified and using the bioregimes that we're talking about in terms of increase in profits at the end of the day. And then when you add a new crop, any new crop, I mean, in this case, I think it was an example of gingers in the system, automatically gave them a gain over the conventional farmers. So all of those fears that, you're sort of tweaking a system that is going to cause collapse of systems, quoting these guys in Wageningen, or this idea that, there will be widespread revolt for doing the sort of things that we're doing. Actually, it doesn't. But you just have to start small and demonstrating to the farmers that, well, here are the ideas, understand what's going on, try it, and then let's see what happens. And then I come to, I guess, to my fifth lesson, is that don't be afraid to reimagine. I think I like this idea that, oil palm is already a perennial system. The UK government is looking at how do we shift from arable agriculture to perennial agriculture. Oil palm's already there. It's already a 25-year, 30-year horizon in terms of a crop cycle. This idea of chemical-free farming is already practiced. You also have local industries in the form of mills, rice mills, etc. There's also household waste, there's community waste. All of these things are closely connected to the farm. They're all right for bringing them back into the farms. There's also different ideas of, we've seen for ourselves where trees have been part of the equation. So this idea that actually palms need not necessarily be a 25-year cycle of disaster to the soils, because I think when you understand that you're actually trying to minimize soil disturbance, in the next replant, don't bring back your bulldozers and clear the land and plant your next cycle and then saying, well, it doesn't work because we still need to put fertilizer, because you've had a catastrophic episode to your soils. But if we understand this now, your next replants will be gentler. We will have less soil loss as a result of this. So what is exciting is to be able to quantify this. It's something that, I've always been poor at maths, but, having people like DAS and CEH behind us, at least it gives us a platform to start to look at how does management and practices combine to develop these carbon-free farms or low carbon farms. I won't show you this video, but I think the main point of this was simply that what we are doing already exists. So whatever we are doing is already here. I mean, and the main thing is that we are starting on a very small scale, but understanding that once we have the data, once we have the recognition from the farmers that they are working, once we build what we call biotransformation units on the ground, so because you do need to access fermented waste, composted waste, etc., and be able to get them into farms in a way that everyone still, will be willing to buy this at a local level. It's still cheaper than any other alternatives. Creating the business case for biofarms to exist is very much the space that we're in right now.